Hello and welcome back to Geo Stories. Tonight, we're going to talk about a city that lived a perfectly ordinary morning in the late summer of the year 79. A town where bakers slid loaves into stone ovens, where painters climbed down from ladders after touching up election slogans on the walls, and where merchants counted the day's coins in the shade of striped awnings. By the time the sun had crossed the sky, none of them would be alive, and their city would begin a silence that lasted for more than 1,700 years. The mountain behind the town had no name for danger. No living person knew it was a volcano. Vineyards climbed halfway up its slopes. Farmers built stone walls along its ridges. Children were born at its foot, grew old with a view of it, and died having never once been warned. The story of Pompeii is the story of that not knowing, and of the astonishing accident by which the very thing that killed the city became the only reason we ever heard of it at all. Before we go further, if you find something calming in these long, slow histories, you might like the video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy what I do here. There is no need otherwise. And if you feel like it, leave your location and your local time down in the comments. It is a quiet, pleasant thing to know that someone in another city, in another hour of the night, is settling in to hear the same story you are. So make yourself comfortable, lower the lights, rest your head, and let yourself drift as we go back to a warm morning by the Bay of Naples, nearly 2,000 years ago. To understand what was lost, we have to understand what was there. Pompeii was not, as some later imaginings would have it, a great capital or a place of unusual importance. It was a middle-sized town, prosperous, cheerful, and a little bit tacky, of the kind that Roman Italy produced in dozens. It sat about 5 miles from the sea, on a low plateau of old volcanic rock that no one at the time recognized for what it was. It looked south over fertile plains and west toward the glittering waters of the Bay of Naples. It looked north to the great mountain, and that mountain, in the late 70s of the 1st century, was called simply Vesuvius, nothing more. The town had begun many centuries earlier as a settlement of the Oscan people, one of the ancient tribes of Italy who lived in the region long before Rome mattered. Over time, it had passed under the influence of the Etruscans, then the Greeks who founded colonies along this coast, then the Samnites of the mountains, and finally, and definitively, the Romans, who had absorbed it into their expanding republic in the years around 80 BC. By the time of our story, Pompeii had been a Roman town for more than 150 years, long enough for its walls, its temples, its language, and its politics to have taken on the full character of Rome. But the layers of its older past could still be read in the shape of its streets and in the names carved on old family tombs outside the gates. The population was probably somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people, though no one can say exactly. It was walled on all sides, with 7 gates, and inside those walls the streets ran in a rough grid, paved with great blocks of hard grey basalt worn smooth by generations of cart wheels. At the crossings of the streets, high stepping stones stood in the roadway, enough space between them for wheels to pass, enough height to keep the feet of pedestrians out of the water that ran along the gutters in wet weather. It was a town built for daily life, not for grandeur. The heart of Pompeii was its forum, a long, rectangular open square at the western end of the town, surrounded by columns and by the buildings that mattered most. At one end stood the great temple of Jupiter, framed by a view of Vesuvius rising behind it, and on any bright morning its marble front would gleam against the green of the mountain. Nearby stood the basilica, the covered hall where legal cases were argued and business deals were struck. There was the market building for meat and fish, a hall for wool merchants, offices for the town's magistrates, and a smaller temple dedicated to the imperial family, because Pompeii, like every good Roman town, had learned to bless the reigning emperor with public prayers. Life in the forum was noisy, crowded, and shrewd. Farmers from the countryside brought in olives, grapes, and grain. Fishermen carried baskets up from the coast. Slaves ran errands for wealthy households. Politicians and their friends stood in shaded corners and argued. Everyone who had anything to sell, buy, or announce came here at some point during the day. Above them, on the walls, the town spoke in ink and paint. Pompeii, more than almost any other Roman town, was covered in writing. Painted political posters, hand-scrawled love notes, Advertisements for gladiator shows, prices for food and wine, insults, jokes, and the occasional line of poetry, all of it applied directly to the plaster with astonishing frankness. This was not a solemn place. It was a place where people talked constantly, and much of what they said got written down where the next passerby could read it. Politics in Pompeii ran hot. The town governed itself through elected magistrates, the two chief officers each year being called duumvirs, and the campaigns for these offices were fought with the same energy that a Roman city block would put into a chariot race. On the walls of the streets, one could read, freshly painted in bright red letters, appeals like "Vote for Marcus Caecilius Marcellus, a good young man," or "The mule drivers ask you to elect Gaius Julius Polybius." Some notices were signed by trade associations, others by neighbors, others still by, quite plainly, the women of a particular street who by law could not vote but who could clearly express their preferences. It is one of the small marvels of Pompeii that these notices, applied only weeks before the eruption, dried on the walls, and then were sealed in ash while still perfectly readable, so that we can hear the town arguing about candidates whose names, without the disaster, would have vanished like a whisper. The town's real wealth came from the countryside around it and from the sea just beyond. The plains at the foot of Vesuvius were, and are, some of the richest agricultural land in Italy. Volcanic soil is fabulously fertile, though the people who farmed it never asked why. Vineyards climbed everywhere. The wine of Pompeii and its neighbor Herculaneum was well regarded, exported in ceramic amphoras stamped with the names of the vintners. Olive groves stretched along the slopes. Grain grew in the plains. And down at the coast, the fishermen brought up small oily fish that Pompeii turned into its most famous product of all, garum. Garum was a fermented fish sauce, salty, pungent, and beloved throughout the Roman world. It was made in vats along the shore, where small fish were layered with salt and left in the sun to break down over weeks and months, then filtered and bottled. The best garum was expensive, a delicacy for wealthy tables. The cheaper kind was a staple condiment for ordinary cooking. Pompeii produced it in industrial quantities. One of the town's richest men, a garum merchant named Aulus Umbricius Scaurus, had his handsome house decorated with mosaics of the very jars in which his sauce was shipped, a small proud advertisement in tile of the trade that had raised him from ordinary means into something like celebrity. There were bakeries scattered through the town, more than 30 of them, each with a set of large stone mills turned by donkeys or by mules, grinding grain into flour, and a domed brick oven at the back where the loaves baked in the coals. There were fulleries, where cloth was cleaned and treated in vats using human urine as a source of ammonia. There were dyers' workshops, blacksmiths, leather workers, potters, glass blowers, jewelers, and a great many small taverns and food shops known as thermopolia, where working people could grab a hot meal from the L-shaped stone counters that opened onto the street. Life was busy. Life was messy. Life was very much lived in public. The Romans of Pompeii bathed publicly too, and the town had several bath complexes, some of them recently rebuilt, where citizens spent hours each afternoon soaking, sweating, gossiping, and doing business. They watched sport in a large stone amphitheater at the eastern edge of town. One of the oldest surviving Roman amphitheaters anywhere, where gladiators fought, and where, some 20 years before our story, a famously ugly riot had broken out between the Pompeians and visitors from a neighboring town. Serious enough that the Emperor Nero had banned gladiator games in Pompeii for 10 years as punishment. That ban had recently expired, and the town's love of the games had returned with full enthusiasm. There were painted advertisements everywhere for the next scheduled bouts, the names of the fighters listed with the same fond attention Pompeii gave to its politicians. And there were the wealthy, of course, in their great houses. The domus of a rich Pompeian family was a world of its own. A high-walled home turned inward, away from the noise of the street, with a formal entrance hall opening onto an atrium where a rectangular pool caught rainwater from an opening in the roof. Beyond the atrium lay reception rooms, dining rooms, kitchens, service corridors, and finally, a colonnaded garden at the back where the family took its ease among fountains, statues, and flowering plants. The walls of these rooms were painted, floor to ceiling in bright, elaborate scenes of gods and heroes, landscapes, dancers, cupids, and imagined architecture that opened the walls into painted vistas of impossible palaces. Pompeii was, above all, a town of painted rooms, and its style of wall decoration was so vivid, so playful, and so consistent that when scholars finally recovered it, they invented an entire vocabulary of 4 Pompeian styles to describe it. It is not too much to say that the world's understanding of Roman painting comes almost entirely from this one buried town. All of this was ordinary. That is the thing to hold on to. Ordinary bakers, ordinary politicians, ordinary bathhouses, ordinary dinner parties, ordinary quarrels between neighbors, ordinary loaves of bread. And rising above it all, calm, green, familiar, was Vesuvius. In our next section, we will look more closely at the mountain and at the strange signs the earth was giving in the years and months before the disaster. Signs that a Roman world without geologists could not read. The mountain was, by every appearance, a peaceful neighbor. It rose to nearly 4,000 ft above the plain, its lower slopes cloaked in vineyards, its middle heights in oak and chestnut woods, its upper reaches in scrub and stone. From the Forum of Pompeii, looking north across the tiled rooftops, you could see the whole of it, a broad, blunt, green cone against the sky. It did not smoke. It did not steam. It did not tremble in any way that a passing merchant would notice. Its slopes were dotted with farmsteads, with the summer villas of wealthy Romans who came down from the capital to escape the heat, with vineyards whose wines were sold as far away as Gaul and Britain. The Romans grew rich on the mountain. They did not fear it because they had no reason to. They had, in fact, no word for what it truly was. The concept of a volcano existed in the Roman imagination in a vague and mythological way. There were mountains in Sicily that burned. Etna smoked and rumbled and occasionally spilled fire, and the poets had explained this by saying that the giant Enceladus lay buried beneath it, breathing flame in his rage. The volcanic island of Vulcano, off the Sicilian coast, gave its name to the god of the forge, whose workshop was said to lie beneath it. But these were far away, southern, exotic. A mountain that burned was a curiosity, not a category, and Vesuvius, so far as any Roman knew, did not burn. It had never burned within memory. What no one alive could know was that Vesuvius had, in fact, erupted many times before. Long before the Romans, long before the Oscans, long before human writing of any kind. It had erupted violently and repeatedly across tens of thousands of years, and the whole region around it, the fertile plains, the strange dark soil, the cliffs of soft grey stone that the townspeople quarried to build their walls, was the accumulated debris of those ancient outbursts. The mountain was not a hill that happened to be near a coast. It was the hardened skeleton of an enormous, restless force, and its last major eruption had probably taken place around 1800 BC, more than 18 centuries before Pompeii's final morning. That was long enough ago that no story, no folk memory, no half-remembered warning had survived. The Romans lived on the corpse of a fire that they took for a friendly hillside. There was one man in antiquity who came unnervingly close to guessing the truth. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing about 60 or 70 years before the eruption, had looked at Vesuvius carefully and noted something odd. The rocks near its summit, he observed, looked as though they had once been burned. They were dark, pitted and porous, as though the mountain itself had been in a fire. He speculated, cautiously, that Vesuvius might once have been active, might once have belched flame like Etna, and had since fallen quiet. It was an astonishing piece of observation. It was essentially correct, but it went nowhere. No Roman farmer read Strabo. No Pompeian magistrate ever raised the question in the town council. Strabo's insight sat on a scroll in a library, and the vineyards climbed on. There had been, however, a warning of another kind, and it had arrived 17 years before our story. On the 5th of February in the year 62, the earth around the Bay of Naples had shuddered violently. A great earthquake had struck the region, centered somewhere beneath the plains around Pompeii. In the town itself, the damage was severe. Temples had cracked and partly collapsed. The great forum had been scarred. Statues had toppled from their pedestals. Houses had lost walls and roofs. The public bath complexes were badly damaged. The aqueduct that carried water into the town from the hills was broken. In Herculaneum, along the coast, the shaking was equally bad. In the nearby town of Nuceria, houses fell. Livestock were killed in strange numbers in the surrounding countryside. The philosopher Seneca, writing not long afterward, described the destruction with something like scholarly fascination and reported that a flock of 600 sheep had been found dead in the fields near Pompeii, killed, he thought, by fumes rising from the ground. To the Pompeians, the earthquake was a disaster and a nuisance, but it was not a warning of anything larger. Earthquakes were, in the Roman world, understood as the settling of underground winds, the shifting of subterranean waters, the anger of gods who could be appeased with sacrifice. They were not connected to the mountain, because the mountain gave no sign of connection. The town set about rebuilding, and it did so slowly. 17 years later, on the morning our story is heading toward, the work of repair was still not complete. In the Forum, scaffolding still stood against some of the temples. The temple of Jupiter had been braced, but not fully restored. The public buildings were half-patched. Wealthy homeowners had rebuilt their painted walls in the newest fashion, sometimes covering older murals with fresher, brighter compositions, which is why archaeologists later found in Pompeii a stratigraphy of painting, styles layered on top of one another, the last of them applied only in the final year or two before the end. There is a peculiar melancholy in the archaeology of that long rebuilding. The Pompeians assumed they had survived the worst. The earth had shaken, the temples had cracked, and life had gone on. They repaired, they replanted, they repainted, and they treated the disaster as a chapter that was closing. Some of the damage they simply lived with. A cracked column, a half-finished wall, a shrine still missing its statue. They imagined they had time. They believed the earthquake had been an event, not a symptom. In the last months before the eruption, the earth began, in retrospect, to speak more clearly. There were small tremors, not the great heaving of 62, but smaller, more frequent shocks that rattled the pots on the shelves and sent dust falling from the ceilings. The Pompeians noticed them, complained about them, and got used to them. There is a report, preserved in the letters of the young man who would later write down the whole disaster, that in the days immediately before the eruption, tremors were so frequent that no one paid them much attention anymore, since, as he put it, earthquakes in Campania were not unusual. The wells and springs behaved strangely. Some dried up, others changed the taste of their water. Springs that had run clear for generations turned bitter or sulphurous. Fish in the ponds died without apparent cause. In the countryside, birds were seen flying in odd patterns, and the leaves of certain plants were said to have withered without heat or drought. None of this was read as an approaching catastrophe. The Romans had a whole tradition of reading omens, of course. Priests inspected the livers of sacrificed animals, watched the flight of birds, and interpreted lightning strikes. But the omens were meant to tell them about political matters, about the will of the gods regarding a war or a marriage, not about the geological behavior of a mountain. The signs Vesuvius was giving were, in the Roman categorization of the world, invisible. There was no framework in which a bitter spring was connected to a green cone on the horizon. There was no priesthood for the reading of the ground. And so, on the last night of the town's ordinary existence, Pompeii went to bed as it always had. The households finished their evening meals. The oil lamps were trimmed and put out. The dogs curled up in the doorways where they slept. In the great house of the banker Lucius Caecilius Eucundus, the wax tablets recording his loans were locked in their chest. In the bakery of Modestus, near the center of town, the loaves for the next morning were shaped and set aside to rise overnight, so that they could be pushed into the oven at first light. In the fullery of Stephanus, the last cloths were hung up to dry. In the house of the Vetii, where two freed slaves had grown fabulously wealthy in trade and had turned their home into a small palace of painted rooms, the household slaves banked the fires and locked the outer door. In the villa of Julia Felix, a shrewd businesswoman who rented out part of her property as apartments and a bath complex, tenants settled into their rented rooms for the night. Along the street of the tombs, outside the Herculaneum gate, the stone monuments of the town's dead stood quietly in the moonlight, waiting for the offerings that families would bring on the next feast day. The exact date of what happened next has been a matter of some debate. For a long time, historians settled on the 24th of August, because that is the date given in one version of the surviving eyewitness account. But other clues have made scholars increasingly certain that the true date was later, most likely the 24th of October, in the year 79. The autumn dating fits with what the excavators eventually found in the town. Braziers for warming rooms had been set up in some houses. Storage jars were filled with pomegranates, chestnuts, walnuts, and grape must, the fruit of the autumn harvest, not of the late summer. Some of the victims were wearing woolen clothing rather than the lighter linens of August. A coin found in a purse on one of the dead had been minted only weeks before the eruption and bore a date that pushed the earliest possible time of the disaster into September. And so the modern consensus has shifted. Not high summer, but the golden edge of autumn. A morning when the vines on the mountain were heavy with grapes, when the town's presses were preparing for the year's vintage, when the days were still warm but the nights had begun to cool. That morning, whatever its precise date, dawned bright and clear over the Bay of Naples. The sun came up over the mountains to the east and struck the tiled roofs of Pompeii and Herculaneum and the villas along the shore. In the forum, the shopkeepers opened their shutters. The bakers pulled the first loaves from their ovens. The public slaves who cleaned the streets went about their work. The children of the town began the walk to their tutors. Across the bay, at the naval base of Misenum, a distinguished elderly admiral, whose name we will come to know very well, was preparing for a quiet morning of study. None of them looked up at the mountain, because there was no reason to. It was, as it had always been, calm, green, and familiar. In the next section, we will follow that morning as it unfolded, hour by hour, into a midday when the sky itself would tear open, and we will meet the small handful of people whose words and gestures, and even whose last positions would come down to us across nearly 2,000 years. The morning wore on in the way of all Pompeian mornings. By the second hour after sunrise, the streets were fully awake. Carts rolled through the paved lanes, their wheels grinding into the ruts worn deep by generations of traffic. The public fountains at the street corners flowed with cool water from the aqueduct, and slaves and free women alike stopped to fill jars and to trade a word or two with their neighbors. In the taverns near the forum, the first customers of the day were leaning on the marble counters, drinking watered wine and eating bread with cheese and olives before returning to whatever work the day held. Somewhere, a barber was shaving a customer in a doorway. Somewhere, a schoolmaster was reciting Virgil to a group of bored boys. Somewhere, a woman was scolding a slave for spilling flour on the kitchen floor. Across the bay, at the naval base of Misenum, on the opposite headland from Vesuvius, some 20 miles away by water, one of the most learned men of the Roman world was settling into his study. His name was Gaius Plinius Secundus, and history knows him now as Pliny the Elder. He was in his mid-50s, a man of enormous appetite for knowledge, who had spent his life collecting facts about the natural world with the patience of a man building a great mosaic one tile at a time. He had recently completed his masterpiece, a vast encyclopedia in 37 books called The Natural History, in which he had tried to gather everything that was then known about the earth, the heavens, plants, animals, minerals, medicines, arts, and industries. It was a work of stupendous ambition. It was also, in many places, wildly wrong, but it was the closest thing the ancient world had produced to a complete description of everything, and Pliny was justly famous for it. He also happened to hold a position of real practical importance. He was the commander of the Roman fleet at Misenum, one of the two great naval bases of the empire from which the western Mediterranean was patrolled. He was, in effect, an admiral. And he took his duties seriously, though he preferred to spend as much of his time as possible reading and writing, dictating notes to a slave scribe, having books read aloud to him during meals, and even, on the rare occasions when he traveled in a covered chair through the streets, being read to on the way. He believed, as he often said, that any hour not spent in study was an hour wasted. Living with him at Misenum that year was his sister, Plinia, and her son, a boy of 17 named Gaius Plinius Caecilius Secundus, whom his uncle had adopted and was raising as his own. This boy, whom history knows as Pliny the Younger, was studious like his uncle, though of a quieter and more literary temperament. He was working on his Latin composition that morning, at his uncle's insistence, writing out passages of the historian Livy in his own hand as an exercise in style. He was, at 17, already showing the traits that would later make him one of the most graceful letter writers in Roman literature. Careful with words, observant of people, and above all, honest about what he saw and did not see. Neither uncle nor nephew on that morning had any idea that within a few hours one of them would be dead, and the other would be the eyewitness who preserved the whole event for posterity. Back at Pompeii, the sun climbed higher. Around midday, the temperature was warm, though not oppressive for the season, and the town had settled into the slower rhythm of the early afternoon. Many shops closed for a few hours. The wealthier households sat down to their main meal of the day. The public baths began to fill. The forum still hummed with business. And then, at some hour between midday and 1 in the afternoon, the mountains spoke. There was a sound. Those who lived through the opening moments and had time to describe them later spoke of a deep, tremendous boom, as though the earth had cracked open, followed by a shaking that ran through the town and rattled every roof tile in Pompeii. And then, rising above Vesuvius, an enormous column of dark material shot straight up into the sky. It went up fast, fast in a way that nothing natural was supposed to move. It climbed thousands of feet in seconds, and it kept climbing. Higher than any cloud, higher than any bird, higher than the imagination of the people watching had any reference point for. It rose to what modern scientists have since calculated to be a height of nearly 20 mi, punching through the ordinary atmosphere and into the stratosphere, and at the top it spread outward in a broad, flat crown that darkened the sky for miles around. Across the bay at Misenum, Pliny the elder's sister happened to be outside and saw it first. She hurried to her brother, who was in his study, and told him to come out at once and look at something extraordinary. Pliny, according to the account his nephew later wrote, had been taking a cold bath and then had lain down to read after lunch, as was his habit. He got up, went outside, and looked. He was, before anything else, a naturalist, and a naturalist confronted with a phenomenon of that scale did what a naturalist does. He went to observe it more closely. The cloud, his nephew later wrote in a famous passage, was shaped like a pine tree. Not the small pines of the north, but the great umbrella pines of Italy, with a long, straight trunk and a wide, flat, spreading crown. It rose from the earth on a single, tall stem and then opened out at the top into branches. Pliny the younger noted, with the eye of a boy who had grown up around a naturalist, that it was sometimes white, sometimes darker and streaked, depending on whether it carried more or less ash. That single image, the pine tree cloud, is one of the most exact descriptions of a volcanic eruption ever set down in words. So exact, in fact, that modern volcanologists, when they classify a certain kind of enormous explosive eruption, one that sends a sustained column many miles into the sky and rains ash across a huge region, call it a Plinian eruption, in honor of the boy who watched it and later described it. Vesuvius, on that afternoon, was inventing a category of natural disaster that would still bear the family name nearly 2,000 years later. The elder Pliny called for a light ship to be prepared. He wanted to sail across the bay for a closer view. He invited his nephew to come along, which was itself a mark of how little he yet grasped the danger. But young Pliny declined. He said, and it is a rare moment of honesty in a Roman memoir, that he preferred to stay behind and finish his writing exercise. He was, as he later admitted, being lazy, and he thanked whatever gods watched over lazy schoolboys for the rest of his life. Before Pliny could leave, a message reached him that changed the entire nature of the trip. A woman named Rectina, the wife of a friend of his, sent a desperate note. She lived in a villa at the foot of the mountain, and she wrote that her house was already directly beneath the falling cloud, that ash and hot stones were coming down all around her, and that the only escape was by sea. She begged him to save her. At that, Pliny the elder's mission changed. He was no longer a naturalist going to observe a curiosity. He was a Roman admiral in charge of a fleet whose duty was to help the people of the region. He ordered not a small ship, but the great warships of the fleet, the heavy quadriremes with their multiple banks of oars, to be launched at once. He would sail to the coast and rescue as many people as he could. He would take his notes along the way, because he could not stop being who he was, but he would go now as a rescuer, not a spectator. It is worth stopping for a moment on what he did next, because it is one of the most extraordinary decisions in all of ancient history. Pliny the Elder, without hesitation, ordered his fleet directly toward the erupting volcano. This is history's first recorded rescue mission by an organized military force in response to a natural disaster. There was no precedent for it. There was no manual. There was no expectation in the Roman mind that a fleet's job included saving civilians from a mountain. But Pliny saw the situation, understood what was needed, and acted. He told his helmsman, when the man expressed reluctance to sail into the falling ash, the words that Roman schoolboys would later memorize for centuries: "Fortune favors the bold." He then ordered the ships forward. Meanwhile, in Pompeii itself, the situation was rapidly becoming impossible. The pine tree cloud, as young Pliny had called it, was drifting on the wind, and the wind that day was blowing from the north-northwest. It was carrying the entire enormous plume of ash and pumice directly over Pompeii and away from Herculaneum, which sat closer to the mountain, but on its western side. Herculaneum, on that first afternoon, saw the eruption clearly and heard it, and was frightened, but had not yet received any real fall of material. Its people watched the strange black tree in the sky and wondered whether to flee. Pompeii, by contrast, was beginning to be buried. The material that fell first was not mostly ash. It was pumice, small, light, porous stones of volcanic rock, ranging from the size of peas to the size of walnuts, still warm from the heart of the mountain. They rained down on the tiled roofs of the town in a steady patter that soon became a roar. They filled the gutters and piled up in the corners of the courtyards. They struck people on the head and shoulders as they ran through the streets. They were light enough that a single stone did little harm, but they accumulated with terrible speed. Within an hour, they had covered the pavements. Within a few hours, they were ankle deep. Within half a day, they would be waist deep, and the roofs of the town would begin to groan under the weight. The Pompeians did what people do in such moments. Some panicked. Some tried to leave immediately, gathering their families and whatever they could carry, and pushing out through the gates onto the roads that led south, away from the mountain. Some tried to shelter inside their houses, closing shutters and doors, believing that the storm would pass. Some went to the temples to pray. Some, and this we know from the objects later found scattered across the town, tried to protect their most valuable possessions, tying jewelry into cloth bundles, hiding coins in the folds of their clothing, packing bronze lamps and silver dishes into baskets. In the house of the Vetii, the two brothers who owned it took stock of what to carry. In the fullery of Stephanus, the workers abandoned the laundry. In the bakery of Modestus, the last batch of loaves went into the oven and would still be there, blackened but unmistakable, when archaeologists opened it 17 centuries later. Somewhere in the town, tied to his post outside a shop, a dog began to strain at his chain. In the next section, we will follow the afternoon and evening of that first terrible day, as Pliny's fleet closed on the coast, as Pompeii began to disappear under the falling pumice, and as the first people who would never leave began to die in their homes and in the streets. The afternoon deepened, and the sky over Pompeii grew darker than any evening the townspeople had ever known. It was not the darkness of a storm cloud passing over the sun. It was heavier, closer, more total. The pine tree cloud, still rising and still spreading, was now vast enough to blot out the light across a wide stretch of the bay, and beneath it, the town was falling into an unnatural twilight in the middle of the day. Lamps had to be lit inside houses that at this hour should have been bright with sun. The oil in those lamps flickered strangely because the air itself was thick with fine dust and with the smell of sulfur. The pumice kept falling. It fell at a rate of perhaps 6 inches an hour, sometimes more, and it did not stop. In the paved streets, it hissed as it struck the stones. On the tiled roofs, it drummed in a rising, ceaseless roar. In the open courtyards of the great houses, it piled up in the corners and drifted against the walls like a dry, warm snow that no wind would sweep away. It gathered on the leaves of the plants in the peristyle gardens, weighing them down until the branches snapped. It filled the shallow, rectangular pools of the atriums, turning the clear rainwater into a grey sludge. People inside their houses began to make the calculations that people always make in disasters. Should they stay or should they go? The instinct to shelter, to close the shutters against the outside and wait, was very strong, and for many households it won. The walls of a Roman house were thick, made of concrete and rubble and brick, and they felt solid. The idea of stepping outside, into the falling stones and the darkness, took a courage that not everyone could summon. Some families gathered in their innermost rooms, the ones without windows to the outside, and closed themselves in. Others climbed to the upper floors, thinking that the higher they went, the safer they would be from whatever was rising around them. This was a fatal mistake, but they had no way to know it. Others chose to run. They gathered what they could carry, the most portable of their valuables, and stepped out into the streets. The scene must have been extraordinary. In the streaming grey dusk, with pumice piling around their ankles and then their knees, families moved toward the town gates, holding cloths over their faces to keep the dust from their mouths. Some carried children. Some carried the elderly on their backs. Some drove animals ahead of them. Some clutched small chests containing coins and jewelry. Some carried, with the strange logic of panic, a single object of no obvious value at all: a favorite lamp, a household statue, a wax tablet of unfinished correspondence. The gates of the town were choked with people. The road south, toward Nuceria and Stabii, was crowded with refugees. Those who reached it early had a chance. They walked out from beneath the falling cloud, and within a few miles, found air that could be breathed and a sky that grew lighter as they moved away from the mountain's shadow. They looked back and saw their town disappearing into darkness, and they kept walking. Many survived. This is one of the things we sometimes forget when we speak of Pompeii. The town did not die all at once, and it did not die completely. Thousands of Pompeians got out. They walked to Nuceria, to Stabii, to Salinum, and they told their stories to the neighbors who took them in. They were the reason that the fate of Pompeii was known, in general terms, in the Roman world, even before anyone came back to look for the town itself. But those who left it too late, or who chose to stay, faced a mounting horror. The pumice was now piling so deep against doors that opening them from the inside was becoming difficult. In some houses, the accumulation on the roof reached weights that the beams had never been designed to hold. Wooden rafters that had stood for a century began to creak and to bend. Tiles cracked. Then, in one house after another, roofs began to collapse. They came down in a rush, dumping tons of hot pumice and shattered timber onto the people sheltering beneath them. Whole families were killed in a moment as their own homes fell in on them. In other houses, the roof held, but the doors were now buried under so much fallen stone from outside that no one inside could get out. They were sealed in as surely as if the doors had been walled up with masonry. Across the bay at Misenum, Pliny the Elder's fleet was underway. He had launched, by his own order, several of the heavy warships and had set course directly toward the coast beneath the cloud. Sailing was not easy. The wind that was carrying the ash toward the south was against him, and the sea was already becoming strange, with a heavy swell that had no obvious cause. Ash began to fall on the decks even as they crossed the bay. The pumice, being lighter than water, was floating in great mats on the surface of the sea, making progress slower and more difficult. Hot cinders drifted down onto the ships and had to be brushed away before they could set the sails alight. And still Pliny went forward. His nephew's account preserves the character of the man in this moment with a nephew's clarity. His uncle, he wrote, was not merely brave. He was so absorbed in what he was seeing that he seemed to have forgotten to be afraid. He called for wax tablets and dictated observations of the phenomenon as the ship advanced. He described the changing colors of the cloud, the sound of the falling stones, the behavior of the sea. He was, up to the last moments of his life, taking notes. He could not reach Rectina. The coast beneath the villa where she had written her plea was now impossible to approach. The pumice on the water was too thick, the falling debris too heavy, the shore too dangerous. His helmsman begged him to turn back. Pliny, ever the Roman, refused. Turn back, he said, was not an option. If he could not go to Rectina, he would go to another friend, a man named Pomponianus, who lived a little further south at Stabii, and he would help the people of that town instead. He gave the order to change course. At Stabii, some 4 miles south of Pompeii along the coast, The situation was frightening, but not yet catastrophic. The wind that was carrying the ash away from Herculaneum was carrying it, in a slightly different pattern, past Stabii as well. The town was seeing some fall of pumice, but not the burying weight that was crushing Pompeii. Pomponianus and his household had loaded their carts and were ready to sail away as soon as the wind changed. When Pliny's ships arrived, the old admiral disembarked, embraced his friend, and did the most extraordinary thing that any observer of this eruption could have done. He behaved as though nothing unusual were happening. He asked for a bath. He was given one. He then sat down to a full dinner with his host, ate with visible appetite, and made light conversation. His nephew, writing later, said that his uncle's calm at Stabii was either genuine, in which case it was the courage of a philosopher, or affected, in which case it was the courage of a Roman gentleman, which was in some ways even greater. Either way, it steadied everyone around him. Pomponianus, who had been on the edge of panic, took heart. The servants stopped weeping. The household followed the admiral's lead and pretended, for a few hours, that this was an ordinary evening. Pliny even went to bed, and by the report of the slaves who stood outside his door, slept soundly, his breathing loud enough to be heard in the corridor, because he was, among his other characteristics, a man who snored. Meanwhile, night had fallen over Pompeii, though the fall of the light was hard to distinguish from the fall of the ash. The town was now buried to depths of several feet in pumice. The streets were impassable to carts. Anyone still trying to leave was struggling on foot through waist-deep drifts of hot stone. Many, exhausted, sat down to rest against the walls of houses and did not get up again. The stones were warm. The air was suffocating. The dust was in their lungs. Some people died sitting up with their backs against the walls, and their bodies would be found in exactly those positions in the centuries to come. The temples of Pompeii, which had stood at the heart of the town's civic life, filled with people praying. In the temple of Isis, an Egyptian goddess whose cult was popular in the town, priests were caught mid-ritual. Later excavators found the remains of a meal on the temple table, a last offering interrupted by the disaster, and the bones of the priests scattered nearby. In the temple of Apollo, in the temple of Venus, the town's patron deity, the same scenes were repeating. The Pompeians turned to their gods, and the gods, being what they were, said nothing. In the countryside around the town, the villas of the wealthy were meeting the same fate. Some of these were vast establishments, working farms as well as luxurious homes, with hundreds of amphoras of wine in their cellars, presses for oil, quarters for slaves who tended the vineyards and the fields. The great Villa of the Mysteries, just outside the walls to the north, with its famous painted room showing the initiation rites of the god Dionysus, sat directly in the path of the falling ash. The Villa of the Papyri, further west near Herculaneum, home to a wealthy Roman family with a library of Greek philosophical scrolls that would later prove to be one of the most important literary discoveries of the ancient world, waited its turn. Everywhere across the region, farms and estates and villages were being buried. And at Herculaneum, the town closest to the mountain, the mood was different from Pompeii. Because the wind was blowing the ash away from Herculaneum, the town had received relatively little pumice through the afternoon and evening. Its inhabitants could see the eruption. They could hear it. They could feel the ground shaking beneath their feet, but they were not being buried alive. Many of them had by evening decided to flee down to the beach at the foot of the town, where a series of vaulted stone chambers, used as boathouses and storage sheds, opened onto the shore. There they hoped they could wait for boats to take them away across the bay. Some hundreds of people, whole families with their servants and their small children, gathered in these chambers along the beach through the evening and into the night. They took with them their money, their jewelry, their portable valuables. They waited. Beyond the sea, across the bay at Misenum, young Pliny and his mother were feeling the tremors grow worse. The ground shook so violently that objects fell from the shelves. The night was very dark, though it was only late evening, and the darkness was made stranger by flashes of fire visible on the horizon in the direction of the mountain. The boy tried to keep working on his livy. His mother could not sleep. Neither of them yet knew that the calmest moment of that terrible night on the other shore had already passed. In the next section, we will follow the deepening of the disaster into the small hours of the morning, when the eruption entered a new and far more terrible phase, when the great column above the mountain, at last, began to fail. Through the deep hours of that first night, the pine tree cloud kept rising, and the mountain kept feeding it. The eruption had already lasted longer than any eruption in the history that anyone at Misenum or Stabii could name, though of course they had no basis for comparison. The column of ash and pumice was still being driven upward by the ferocious pressure of gas escaping from the magma chamber deep beneath Vesuvius, and it was still being held aloft by that same pressure, expanding and cooling in the upper atmosphere and drifting on the high winds toward the south. But the mountain, though the observers below could not know it, was beginning to exhaust itself in the particular way that made this eruption so much more terrible than a simple burial by falling ash. The mechanism is worth pausing on, because it is the physical fact at the center of everything that follows. A great explosive eruption of this kind, what modern volcanologists call a Plinian eruption, in honor of the boy who watched it, is a delicate balance. The column stands upright in the sky only because the gas rushing out of the vent is fast enough and hot enough to keep the enormous weight of ash and pumice aloft. As long as the pressure holds, the ash goes up and drifts away on the wind, and the destruction, while terrible, is at least distant. Things fall out of the sky slowly. People can, if they are lucky, run. But when the pressure begins to fail, when the vent widens too much or the gas flow slows, the column can no longer support itself. It collapses. The ash and pumice, no longer held aloft by the upward rush, come pouring back down the sides of the mountain in a torrent, not falling straight, but rushing sideways along the ground, carried by their own weight and by their still blistering heat. This kind of flow is called a pyroclastic surge. It moves at speeds of 100 miles an hour or more. Its temperature can reach 500 or 600 degrees Fahrenheit, sometimes higher. It contains almost no breathable air. It is denser than air, and it hugs the ground, filling valleys, pouring over walls, rushing through streets and doorways. Nothing living survives it. Nothing that stands in its path survives it. It is the fire that Strabo had suspected in the rocks, come out at last. In the small hours of the night, sometime in the darkness before dawn, the great column above Vesuvius began, for the first time, to falter. The first collapse was partial. A section of the column gave way, and a surge of hot ash and gas rushed down the western flank of the mountain. It moved fast. It moved silently, in the sense that nothing in its path had time to hear it coming, and it moved directly toward Herculaneum. Herculaneum, remember, had been spared through the afternoon and evening. The wind that carried the ash south to Pompeii had left Herculaneum in relative peace. Its inhabitants had watched the eruption with fear. Some had fled inland. Others had gathered on the beach in the vaulted boat chambers, waiting for rescue by sea. Perhaps 300 or 400 people were in those chambers when the surge came. They heard, if they heard anything at all, only a single terrible sound, a kind of rushing wind, in the last second of their lives. The surge poured down over the town at somewhere near 100 mph, and it filled Herculaneum from end to end. In the boat chambers along the beach, the huddled families were killed instantly. The heat was so intense that it did not so much burn the bodies as flash them into a state that no ordinary fire produces. Modern examination of the skeletons found there in the 20th century showed that the brains of some victims had literally boiled, their skulls fractured by the internal pressure in a way that only sustained temperatures above about 900 degrees Fahrenheit could produce. Bones cracked. Muscles contracted violently in the split second before death, twisting arms and legs into unnatural positions. There was no time for pain. There was, in the medical sense, almost no time for anything. Above the beach, in the town itself, everything organic caught fire or was carbonized in place. Wooden beams, wooden shutters, wooden furniture, wooden doors, all turned in an instant to blackened lumps of carbon, holding their shape but no longer their substance. The papyrus scrolls in the library of the Villa of the Papyri, hundreds of them containing works of Greek philosophy, some of which existed nowhere else, were carbonized so completely that they turned to charcoal, but held together in cylindrical shape, so that they could still be recognized as scrolls. Loaves of bread on shelves in kitchens turned into perfect carbonized loaves. A wooden cradle, with an infant still inside, turned to charcoal around its small occupant. The whole living town, in the moment of that first surge, became a series of dark relics of itself, sealed under the flood of hot ash that continued to pour down after the surge, filling the streets and the rooms to a depth that would eventually reach 65 ft, more than the height of a six-story building. Herculaneum did not burn to the ground. Herculaneum was, in a very strange sense, preserved by its death. The absence of oxygen in the surges, the speed of the burial, the depth of the eventual covering, all combined to keep the town intact beneath its enormous shroud. Second stories that had fallen elsewhere were at Herculaneum, still standing, their upper windows still open onto air, though that air was now solid rock. Wooden doors still hung in their frames. Beds still stood in bedrooms, with the outlines of the last people who had lain in them. The very hairs of a woman's head, tied up in a bun on the last morning, were preserved as impressions in the hardened ash. Nothing of this kind is preserved anywhere else in the ancient world. Nothing. The catastrophe made Herculaneum, in some ways, the most complete Roman town that has ever come down to us. That, of course, is what those who died in it paid for. The first surge did not reach Pompeii. Pompeii, further south, was still being buried by falling pumice from above, and the surge that engulfed Herculaneum did not travel that far. But the pattern had begun. The mountain was now oscillating between two modes. When the column held, ash fell from above. When the column failed, surges swept down the flanks. Through the rest of the night, and into the early morning, the surges came again and again, each one larger than the last, and each one reaching further from the mountain than the one before. At Stabi, further south still, the elderly Admiral Pliny slept on. His nephew's account preserves the extraordinary detail that servants standing outside the door heard him snoring loudly in the middle of the night, while the ground shook and the air outside grew thicker with ash. The house of Pomponianus, where he lay, was now filling with pumice in its courtyards, and the pumice had begun to pile so high against the doors that if Pliny had waited much longer, he would have been buried inside. His slaves eventually decided that he must be woken, and they knocked at his door until he came out. He walked with them into the courtyard, where his host and the other members of the household had gathered, and they held a hurried discussion about what to do. The choice they faced was ugly. To stay inside the house was to risk being trapped or crushed by a collapsing roof. To go outside was to risk being struck by falling stones. The stones, they decided, could at least be seen and dodged, in a way. Roofs could not be predicted, so they chose the open air. They tied cushions to their heads with cloths to protect them from the falling pumice, a small detail that his nephew preserved, because it was the kind of thing that only actually happened, and would not have been invented, and they went out into the streets to make their way toward the shore, where perhaps a ship might still take them off. Around them, the sky was black. The dawn should have been coming by now, but no light reached the town. His nephew, later writing to the historian Tacitus, described the moment with the precision that Tacitus loved. It was, he said, blacker and denser than any night, and they walked through it carrying torches whose light seemed only to make the darkness around them more visible. The sea, when they reached the shore, was impassable. The waves were driving inland in a strange, contrary rhythm, and the water was full of debris. There would be no escape by boat. Pliny, by now, was struggling. He had asthma, in the sense that we would understand the term today, or some related condition that made breathing in fouled air especially difficult. The air on the beach at Stabii was full of sulfur, and it grew worse with every hour. He asked to be given water, drank it, and asked for more. Then he lay down on a sail that his slaves had spread on the sand, and he closed his eyes, and he did not get up again. Whether he died of the fumes, of the heat, of a heart attack in his exhausted body, or of some combination of all three, no one who was there could say for certain. He was 55 years old. He had commanded the fleet, written the greatest encyclopedia of his age, refused to turn back, and quoted his favorite maxim at the moment when it mattered. He had also, in ordering that fleet to sail toward the eruption, invented the idea of an organized disaster response. When his body was found 2 days later, after the surges had passed and the ash had settled, his slaves reported that he looked, to their eyes, as though he were sleeping rather than dead. His nephew took some comfort in that. Across the bay at Misenum, the boy who would preserve all of this had endured his own long night. The tremors at Misenum had grown so violent by early morning that his mother had insisted they leave the town. They joined a crowd of people fleeing on foot, and as they moved along the road, the ground shook so hard that carriages, even when wedged with stones, rolled and slid. The sea, seen from the shore, had retreated far from the beach, exposing sand and rocks and stranded fish, which is a phenomenon that today we recognize as the drawback that sometimes precedes a tsunami. Above the mountain across the bay, a black cloud was now rolling down and outward, spreading in every direction. And to the sky, above the fleeing crowd at Misenum, a strange darkness was coming. They did not yet know what had happened at Herculaneum. They did not yet know what was about to happen at Pompeii. In the next section, we will follow the last hours of the town itself, as the surges at last reached its walls and as the silence began. By the last hours before dawn on that second day of the eruption, Pompeii had already been transformed into a place that its inhabitants of the morning before could not have recognized. The pumice had piled to depths that reached, in many streets, above the ground floor windows. The colonnades of the forum stood half buried, their columns rising like the trunks of trees from a strange, dry drift of stone. The tiled roofs of the town, where they had not already collapsed, were bowed under the weight, and many of them had given way in the night, dumping tons of pumice into the rooms below and killing whoever sheltered there. In houses whose roofs still held, families sat pressed together in the dark, their oil lamps guttering in the fouled air, listening to the roar that had not stopped for nearly a full day and waiting for a morning that would not come as they knew it. Perhaps 2,000 people were still inside Pompeii at that hour. This is a rough number, and no one will ever know the exact figure, but it is the best estimate that later study of the site has produced. 2,000 out of the 10 to 20,000 who had lived there the day before. Most had fled successfully in the first hours, walking south to Stabii and Nuceria while there was still time. Some had left later, and their bodies would be found scattered along the roads outside the walls, overtaken as they walked. And some had stayed. They had stayed because their houses were solid, and they trusted them. They had stayed because they were too old or too sick or too young to walk far. They had stayed because they were slaves, and their masters had not left. They had stayed because they were guarding property. They had stayed because they had waited too long, and now the town gates were choked with pumice, and the roads outside were dark, and they could not tell where they would be going. Somewhere in the town, that dog was still on his chain. He had been tied to a post outside a shop on that ordinary morning, in the ordinary way, and no one had come back to release him. He had strained at the chain when the ash first began to fall. He had barked as the pumice piled around his feet. Through the night, he had climbed the rising drift of stone as it grew higher, keeping himself above it, until the chain, which was a fixed length, would not let him climb any further. When his body was found 17 centuries later, the cast of his shape showed him still contorted in the last effort of that climb, his head thrown back, his legs twisted, the collar tight at his neck. He had a name once, and it is not written down anywhere. At the great villa outside the Herculaneum gate, the house of the Vestals, in the house of the Faun with its famous mosaic of Alexander, the great fighting the Persian king, in the house of the tragic poet with its painted sign of a chained dog, and the words cave CANEM, beware of the dog, in the small apartment where a couple slept with their child between them, in the barracks of the gladiators where some of the fighters had put on their parade armor. Perhaps to be found in something like dignity when they were found, everywhere across the town, people were waiting for the end without knowing that the end was already on its way and was no longer coming from the sky. It came from the mountain. Around 6:30 in the morning, by the calculations of modern volcanologists, the great column above Vesuvius, which had already partially collapsed several times in the night to send surges down the western flank onto Herculaneum, collapsed again on a much larger scale. This time the surge went south. It rolled down the slope of the mountain and out across the plain toward Pompeii, moving at somewhere near 100 miles an hour, a black wave of ash and gas at temperatures well above the boiling point of water. It reached the northern walls of the town, poured over them, and swept through the streets in a matter of seconds. The people inside had no warning. There was no sound to alert them, no way to see it coming through the darkness, no place high enough to climb above it. In one moment they were in their houses, or crouched in their doorways, or huddled in the small back rooms where they had sheltered through the night. In the next moment, the air itself was too hot to breathe and too poisonous to inhale, and they were dead. Death, when it came, was not slow. The heat of the surge was sufficient to kill by inhalation alone in a single breath. The gases in the surge, hot enough to cause instant thermal shock to the lungs, killed most of the victims before their bodies had time to burn. The muscles of the dying contracted violently in the fraction of a second between the arrival of the surge and the loss of consciousness, and it was this contraction, called the pugilistic posture by pathologists, that fixed so many of the Pompeiians in the strange half-crouched shapes that would later come out of the plaster casts. Arms raised toward the face, knees drawn up, hands over the mouth in the final gesture of trying to keep out the air. Some died together. In a house near the Herculaneum Gate, a family was later found in the position they had taken when the surge came through the doorway. The father was holding the mother, who was holding the small child between them. All three were pressed against the wall of the room as though they had backed away from something coming at them. The father's arm was still around his wife's shoulders when the plaster was poured, 17 centuries later, into the space their bodies had left in the hardened ash. In another house, a group of servants had gathered in a back room, perhaps to be with each other for whatever was coming. They were found in a rough circle, some sitting, some lying, none of them alone. In the garden of a large house that archaeologists would later call the House of the Golden Bracelet, a woman was found who had been wearing on her arm a gold bracelet shaped like two snakes with heads that met at the clasp. The bracelet was a real object of some worth, and she had put it on that morning, perhaps because she was going somewhere, or perhaps because she always wore it. She was lying on her side, one arm beneath her head, in the position of someone who had lain down to rest for a moment. The bracelet was still around her wrist when she was found. It is now in a museum in Naples. In the Villa of Diomes, outside the town walls, a group of 18 people had gathered in the vaulted cellar to shelter through the night. They had brought lamps and food and money. They had believed the cellar was the strongest room in the house. When the surge came, it poured into the villa through the doors and windows above, and it filled the cellar with hot ash. They were found tightly packed together, some of them still holding each other, one of them clutching a bag of gold coins. The cellar had preserved their positions exactly. The gladiators in their barracks were found in the small cells where they slept and lived. Some had died in their armor. Others were in their everyday clothes. One had a jeweled belt on him, which was a strange thing for a gladiator to own, and archaeologists have speculated ever since whether he had been visiting the barracks on some errand of his own, or whether he had been robbing the place when the surge came, or whether the belt belonged to a wealthy woman who was in the barracks with him and had left it there. The wealthy woman, if she existed, was found nearby. In the house of the Menander, one of the grand houses of the town, the family that owned it seems to have escaped in the first hours. But some of their slaves had stayed behind, perhaps to guard the property or perhaps because they had been left behind in the panic. They were found in the service corridors and small rooms of the household, still in their working clothes, some of them holding tools. A steward had gathered up the family silver into a strongbox and was carrying it towards some place of hiding when he was killed. The silver was found in the box beside him. Someone in a different corner of the same house had been counting coins on a table when the surge came through, and the coins were still in stacks when the room was excavated. The temples filled with the dead. At the temple of Isis, the priests who had been performing their morning rites lay among the ritual objects. At the temple of Apollo, the priests had gathered the temple treasures into bags and were preparing to carry them away when they were overtaken. In the small shrines built into the walls of ordinary houses, the household gods stood untouched above the bodies of the families who had prayed to them. And then, with terrible speed, the surge was gone. It passed through the town in perhaps a minute, and behind it came the pyroclastic flow proper, a denser, slower wave of hot ash and rock that came in behind the surge and buried what the surge had killed. It filled the streets to the tops of the walls. It filled the rooms of the houses through the doors and the collapsed roofs. It filled the courtyards and the wells and the pools. It filled Pompeii, over the course of the next several hours, to a depth of some 10 to 20 feet above the level of the pumice that had already been there. And when the second and third and fourth surges came through in the hours that followed, each one adding another layer, the burial of Pompeii became final and complete. By late morning of the second day, the mountain was still erupting, but it was no longer erupting at the intensity of the previous day. The great column had finished its work. The surges were smaller now and further apart. The wind had shifted, and the ash that continued to fall was drifting in different directions. In the countryside for miles around, farms and villas that had been in the paths of the surges were buried. Others, in slight shelter or a little further away, had only received the ash fall and had a chance of being partially preserved. But at Pompeii and at Herculaneum, the towns were gone. Their walls, their roofs, their streets, their forums, their temples, their houses, their people, and every object in every room had disappeared beneath a covering of stone and ash so deep and so uniform that within a few weeks, when the eruption at last stopped and the survivors returned to look, they could not even find the sites. At Misenum, the boy Pliny and his mother had lived through their own strange dawn. The darkness had come to them across the bay, and the ash had fallen on them, and there had been a moment, described in the letter he would later write, when he and his mother and the crowd around them had believed that they were about to die. His mother had begged him to leave her behind and save himself. He had refused and had held her hand and had walked with her. The darkness had passed. The ash had settled. The sky had cleared, first to an ashy grey, then to a pale sun, then to a strange yellow light like that of an eclipse. They had walked back to Misenum and had found the town still standing, though covered in ash. Later that day, they had learned from those who had been at Stabii that the admiral was dead. In the next section, we will follow the days and weeks that came after. The stunned silence of a region that had lost two of its towns and did not yet fully understand what had happened, and the boy who, many years later, would sit down to write it all out. The mountain took several more days to fall quiet. Even after the great collapses had ended and the surges had stopped reaching out across the plain, Vesuvius continued to smoke and to shake the ground, sending up smaller columns of ash that drifted on the changing wind. The sun, when it broke through it all, was pale and yellowish, filtered by fine dust that had been carried high into the atmosphere and would take months to settle. In Rome, more than 150 miles to the north, the Emperor Titus received word within days that a great disaster had struck the Bay of Naples. Ash was falling in the capital itself, a fine grey powder settling on the tiled roofs of the Palatine and on the marble of the new Colosseum, which had opened only a few months earlier. Ships coming into the port of Ostia reported ash on their decks. Word spread further. Ash from this eruption is now known, from ice cores and from geological deposits, to have fallen as far away as Syria and North Africa. The whole eastern Mediterranean was under its shadow for a season. Titus reacted with the decency that history would come to remember as his best quality. He personally traveled to the region of the disaster twice, saw what could be seen, and organized the relief. He appointed 2 former consuls to oversee the resettlement of the survivors and the redistribution of the property of those who had died without heirs. Money from the imperial treasury was sent to help rebuild the surviving towns of the region, Nuceria, Nola, Salinum, and the string of coastal villas that had not been directly destroyed. Refugees from Pompeii and Herculaneum, and there were many, perhaps 10,000 survivors, found shelter in those towns. Some of them, we know from later inscriptions, settled permanently in Naples. Others went to Cumae. A few, whose names appear in later records, made new lives as far away as Rome itself. But the 2 buried towns themselves were treated in a way that seems strange to us, as sites more or less to be abandoned. There was, at first, some attempt to dig into them. In the weeks and months that followed the eruption, small tunnels were driven through the hardened ash, mostly by looters and treasure seekers, and sometimes by the former owners of houses, trying to retrieve the most valuable objects that had been left behind. The upper stories of some buildings still showed above the ash for a time, and thieves broke through their roofs and pulled out what they could carry. Statues were taken. Marble facings were pried off walls. Bronze fittings were stripped from fountains. In some houses, later excavators would find, 17 centuries later, the tunnels of these ancient looters running through the rooms, and even the scrawled graffiti they left on the walls to guide themselves and their fellow thieves. One tunnel in Pompeii preserves the ancient Latin words house dug through, scratched by a hand that lived within a generation of the eruption. But this kind of digging was piecemeal, and it stopped after a few years. The towns had been buried too deep to be worth systematic recovery. Eventually, no one alive remembered exactly where they had been. Time did its work. The dust settled. The rain came year after year and hardened the ash into a dense grey stone. Grasses sprouted. Vines returned. Farmers moved back into the plains around Vesuvius, and the volcanic soil, made freshly fertile by the very ash that had killed the towns, gave them extraordinary harvests. Within a century or two, the countryside around Vesuvius was as prosperous as it had ever been. New villages grew up. The mountain itself changed shape, its old cone blown apart by the eruption, its new form lower and broader, with a great crater at the top. In time it would erupt again, though never on the scale of 79. It became, and remains, an active volcano, and its shadow still falls over some of the most densely populated countryside in Europe. But of Pompeii and Herculaneum, no visible trace remained. The names survived in old books, in geographical treatises, in the letters of ancient authors. But if you had asked a farmer in the year 500, or 800, or 1200 to point to where they had been, he would not have been able to. And here we must return to the boy who watched it all. Pliny, the younger, was 17 on the day of the eruption. He was 18 when the news of his uncle's death was fully known. He was, for the rest of his life, a serious, careful, elegant Roman gentleman. He rose through the offices that Roman aristocrats rose through. He served as a magistrate. He became a senator. He was consul. He served as an imperial governor in the province of Bithynia in what is now northern Turkey. He wrote a great many letters, hundreds of them, which he later polished and collected for publication, because Roman gentlemen understood that a letter well written was a piece of literature to be read by more people than the person it was addressed to. His letters are among the most valuable documents that survive from the whole ancient Roman world. They tell us how a cultured Roman thought, how he ran his estates, how he treated his slaves, how he wrote poetry with his friends, how he handled a lawsuit, how he interviewed a Christian community in his province and asked the Emperor Trajan what to do about them. That last correspondence, incidentally, is one of the earliest external references to Christianity in any Roman document, and its author was the same man who had, as a boy, watched Vesuvius from Misenum. Some 25 years after the eruption, when Pliny was in his 40s, the historian Tacitus, who was a friend of his and one of the greatest writers in Latin, was working on his own great history of the period. Tacitus wrote to Pliny and asked him for an account of what had happened to Pliny the Elder on the day of the disaster. Tacitus wanted the details because he wanted to include them in his history. Pliny agreed and wrote a letter. And when Tacitus wrote back asking for more, wanting to know what the eruption had looked like from the other side of the bay, what Pliny himself had seen, Pliny wrote a second letter. Those two letters, addressed to Tacitus, are the reason we know what happened. They survived because Pliny included them in the collection of his letters that he published. Tacitus's own account of the eruption, in which those letters were presumably reworked into the flowing prose of a historian, is lost. The books of his history covering that period did not come down to us, but the letters, in the collection of Pliny's own correspondence, did. They passed through the hands of medieval copyists, who transcribed them by candlelight in monastic scriptoria over the course of centuries, and they emerged into the modern world as one of the most vivid first-hand descriptions of a natural disaster ever recorded. Pliny wrote as an old man wrote about the most extraordinary day of his youth. He wrote with restraint, which was the Roman literary style, and with precision, because that was his uncle's style, and it had rubbed off on him. He wrote about the pine tree cloud. He wrote about the way the ash had fallen, and the way the ground had shaken, and the way his mother had begged him to save himself, and the way the sea had retreated, and the way the sun had returned as a strange yellow disk, and the way he and his mother had walked back to Misenum through streets deep in ash. He wrote about his uncle, calmly and with love, and he wrote about his uncle's death, and he preserved the exact words about fortune favoring the bold, and the detail of the cushions tied to the head with cloths, and the snoring behind the door, and the water called for and drunk on the beach. He was very honest, in the second letter, about his own decision to stay behind and finish his Latin composition, and about his fear during the long night. He noted that he could hear the wailing of women and the shouting of men, some of whom were crying out that this was the end of the world, and others that the gods were dead, and others that everything they knew was gone. He set it all down in prose so exact that scientists 1900 years later would still be reading it as source material. The truly extraordinary thing about Pliny's account is not simply that he preserved the event. It is how accurate his observations turned out to be. He described the shape of the eruption column with a precision that later volcanologists could match against ash deposits and pumice layers and confirm point by point. He described the darkness and the direction of the wind and the fall of ash across the region and the tremors of the ground and the retreat of the sea and the return of the light, all in ways that modern science can reconstruct as physically consistent with what must actually have happened. He was 17 when he watched. He was in his 40s when he wrote. And yet the memory, or the notes he had made at the time and kept for decades, gave us a record that has held up under the scrutiny of every science that has ever been brought to bear on it. When modern volcanologists coined the term Plinian eruption for a certain kind of enormous explosive event, with a sustained tall column of ash, they were naming a category of natural phenomenon after the accuracy of a boy's description of his uncle's death. Pliny died sometime around the year 113 or 114, in his early 50s, an age his uncle had also reached. He had never gone back to see the ruins of the town that had killed his uncle. There was nothing to see. The countryside around Vesuvius by that time had already begun its slow return to ordinary life. He was buried, so far as we know, in northern Italy, in the region where he had been born. His letters were his monument, and they are a monument still. For the centuries that followed his death, Pompeii and Herculaneum vanished into the ordinary landscape of southern Italy. The towns that had been built above them changed names. Villages rose and fell, roads shifted, empires collapsed. Rome fell, new peoples came into Italy, new kingdoms rose, the Middle Ages passed. The Renaissance came, and scholars began to read the old Latin authors again, and they read Pliny, and they read Tacitus, and they read Strabo, and they read, in the works of these ancient writers, that there had once been two towns beneath a great mountain that had been buried in a terrible eruption. They knew the mountain. They could see it. It still stood on the shore of the Bay of Naples, still smoked from time to time, still frightened the people who lived beneath it. But of the towns, no one knew exactly where. They were, in every practical sense, lost. In the next section, we will follow the strange story of how they were found again, and of the long, slow beginning of the work that would, in time, bring back Pompeii and Herculaneum from beneath their long silence. The rediscovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum did not happen in a single moment, and it did not happen because anyone was looking for them. It happened, as many of the great archaeological discoveries have happened, by accident, and it happened over the course of 2 centuries, and it began not with scholars, but with workmen digging wells. For centuries after the eruption, the country around Vesuvius had returned to being ordinary Italian farmland. Villages had grown up on the buried sites without knowing they were there. The town that would later be called Torre Annunziata sat directly on top of Pompeii. The town of Resina, later called Ercolano, sat directly on top of Herculaneum. Farmers ploughed fields whose furrows ran only a few feet above the tops of ancient walls. Vineyards grew above buried streets. When landslides or heavy rains exposed a scrap of old wall or a fragment of a painted plaster, the local people took it for the remains of some old Roman country house of the sort that were known to be scattered all over the region, and they broke it up for building stone, or they left it alone. Nothing suggested the presence of whole cities beneath their feet. The first hint came in the year 1594. a wealthy Neapolitan noble named Musio Tartavilla, who owned an estate near the town of Torre Annunziata, was building an aqueduct across his property to carry water from the mountains down to a mill. His workmen, digging the trench for the channel, kept striking walls, painted plaster, columns, and inscriptions. They cut through them, in the way that workmen digging aqueducts cut through everything that gets in their way, and they went on. But one of the inscriptions they brought up carried a single word that caught the attention of a passing architect and scholar named Domenico Fontana, who was one of the great engineers of his age and who had designed the aqueduct. The word was Decuio, Pompis, meaning a town councillor of Pompeii. Fontana was educated enough to know what Pompeii had been and where the ancient sources placed it, and he understood in that moment that his workmen were quite possibly digging through the buried town itself. What he did next is one of the small tragedies of the story. He did nothing. He wrote down the discovery, he mentioned it in passing to some correspondence, and he went on with his aqueduct. The trench was completed. The walls were left broken. The knowledge that Pompeii lay under the fields was, in a limited scholarly way, established. And then it was forgotten again for well over 100 years. The next accident happened above Herculaneum in the year 1709. A farmer was digging a well on his property in the town of Resina, trying to reach the water table beneath his house. His shaft went down through the compacted ash and pumice, and at a depth of many feet, he broke into a hollow space. It was, though he could not have known it at first, the theatre of Herculaneum. When his bucket brought up not water but pieces of coloured marble, he did what a farmer with any wit would do. He sold them. Word of the strange marbles travelled up the coast and eventually reached the ears of an Austrian prince, Emmanuel Maurice of Lorraine, who was at that time serving as an officer in the region and had a taste for antiquities. He bought the farmer's well, so to speak, and had his own men sent down into it. They enlarged the shaft, drove side tunnels into the buried theatre, and began to bring up statues, columns, and inscribed marbles that were plainly of very high quality. Some of these ended up in Vienna, some in Dresden, some in private collections. But no one still understood the scale of what was under the ground. That understanding began to emerge only after 1738, when a new king came to the throne of the Kingdom of Naples. His name was Charles of Bourbon, and he was in his early 20s, energetic, ambitious, and interested, as fashionable young monarchs of the 18th century tended to be in classical antiquity. He heard about the strange discoveries at Resina, and he decided that his kingdom should be doing the digging, not foreign officers. He appointed a Spanish military engineer named Roque Joaquin de Alcubierre to take over the works at what was now understood to be Herculaneum, and he provided a small budget and a workforce of forced labourers, mostly convicts, to do the digging. Alcubierre was, by the standards of any modern archaeologist, a disaster. He knew nothing about ancient Rome. He had no interest in walls or in ordinary objects. He wanted statues, bronzes, mosaics, and inscriptions. His method was simple. He drove tunnels through the buried town, hacked out any object that looked valuable, and left the rest to collapse behind him. He damaged frescoes. He broke up columns. He destroyed context. When he found the Villa of the Papyri in 1750, with its library of carbonized scrolls, he initially threw the scrolls away, thinking they were lumps of coal. Only when one broke and revealed the writing inside did anyone realize what they had. Even then, the scrolls proved so difficult to unroll and read that many were destroyed in the attempt, and the effort to read them properly would continue in various forms for the next 2.5 centuries, right down to our own time, when new imaging techniques finally began to reveal their contents without unrolling them at all. In 1748, 10 years after the work at Herculaneum had begun in earnest, Alcubierre's men opened a trial trench a few miles south, near Torre Annunziata, on a site that had long been called Civita, meaning simply the city, by the local farmers, who knew there was something there. What they found under their spades, almost at once, was Pompeii. The excavations began, and they went on in fits and starts from that day to this. For the first century, the digging was much what it had been at Herculaneum. It was treasure hunting under royal patronage. The best objects were extracted and sent to the royal collections. The rest was left. Sometimes, when it was inconvenient to leave a wall standing after the objects had been taken, the wall was broken down and the trench refilled. When the paintings were too good to remove, artists were sent in to copy them, and then in some cases the paintings themselves were cut out of the walls and taken to Naples. The town, in other words, was being looted more slowly and more thoroughly than the ancient looters had ever managed. And yet, alongside the looting, something else was happening. Every European who came south on the Grand Tour, and by the late 18th century that was every young aristocrat and every ambitious artist and writer, wanted to see Pompeii. It became one of the great sights of the age. Goethe came. Mozart came as a boy. Napoleon's sister Caroline, when her husband ruled Naples, patronized the excavations herself. Painters made images of the ruins. Novelists set their romances there. The very idea of a lost civilization suddenly returning from beneath the earth entered the European imagination, and Pompeii was its greatest example. But the real change in what Pompeii could tell us came when Italy became a single country, and when a new man was put in charge of the excavations. His name was Giuseppe Fiorelli, and he took over the direction of the site in 1863. He was, by the standards of his predecessors, a very different animal. He was a trained scholar. He was systematic, he was patient, and he introduced for the first time the idea that the site was not primarily a source of objects to be extracted, but a place to be understood. He divided the town into regions and numbered every insula and every doorway so that any object found could be recorded to a precise address. He insisted that excavation proceed from the top down, layer by layer, rather than by tunneling in from the side. He kept records. He published reports. He created something recognizable, for the first time, as archaeology. And he did one other thing that changed forever what Pompeii could be. He noticed that the workmen digging in the compacted ash sometimes broke into hollow spaces, empty pockets in the hardened material, whose walls preserved delicate impressions of shapes. It occurred to Fiorelli, or perhaps to one of his assistants, that these hollows were the spaces left behind by the bodies of the people who had died in the surges. The bodies themselves had long since decayed inside their tombs of ash, leaving behind only bones at the center of an empty mold. If plaster were poured carefully into these hollows, through small holes drilled from above, and then allowed to harden, and then the surrounding ash was chipped away, the result would be a plaster cast of the person as they had been at the moment of their death. Fiorelli tried it. It worked. And in 1863, the Pompeiians began to come back. The first casts were terrifying and moving in a way that no one had been prepared for. Human beings emerged from the ash in the exact positions in which they had died. Men, women, children, slaves, whole families lying together, a dog on his chain, twisted in his last effort to climb. Their faces were sometimes clear enough to show expressions. Their clothes were preserved as impressions in the plaster, so that the folds of a tunic, the outline of a sandal strap, the shape of a woman's hair could all be seen. Some of them were still holding objects: a key, a coin, a jewelry box, a cloth wrapped around a small treasure. Fiorelli's casts turned Pompeii from an archaeological site into something that no other site in the world had ever been. It was a place where you could look, in plaster, at the last moment of a private human life, 17 centuries after it had ended. The reaction, when the casts were first shown to the public, was profound. Victorian visitors wept in front of them. Writers described the experience of standing before a plaster child or a plaster mother clutching a plaster baby as one of the most piercing experiences of a life. It was, and it remains, one of the closest things that the study of the past has ever produced to a direct meeting of the eyes across time. The Pompeiians had been buried alive on an autumn morning in 79. They had lain silent for nearly 1,800 years. And now they were being pulled back into the light, mid-gesture, mid-breath, mid-effort, to look back at the people who had come to look at them. In the next section, we will walk with those visitors and with the archaeologists who have followed Fiorelli for the past century and a half through the town as it stands today. And we will meet, one by one, some of the people whose last moments are still visible in the ash. To walk through Pompeii today is to walk through the strangest kind of city that has ever survived on the surface of the earth. It is not a city of ruins, in the sense of the Forum in Rome or the temples on the Athenian Acropolis. Those are noble skeletons, stripped by time and by centuries of quarrying, standing in isolated grandeur against modern buildings. Pompeii is different. Pompeii is a whole town. Its streets still run in the grid the Romans laid down. Its shops still open onto those streets. Its houses still have their front doors. And if you step through one of those doors, you find yourself in the atrium of a family that lived there, with its rainwater pool intact and its painted walls still glowing with the colors the Pompeian decorators used. There are bakeries with their ovens still in place, and the round stone mills still standing beside them where donkeys once turned the grain into flour. There are laundries with their vats. There are wine bars whose marble counters still hold the round openings where the amphoras of wine were kept cool. There is graffiti on the walls, still legible, still gossiping. The town covers about 170 acres. Of that, roughly two-thirds has been excavated, and the rest lies still under the ash, waiting for a future in which the archaeology is careful enough and the money is available. The excavated portion is one of the largest continuously exposed ancient sites in the world, and it is impossible to see it all in a single visit, or in 10 visits, or in 100. There are always corners you have not turned, houses you have not entered, painted rooms whose colors you have not stood in front of. And in each of those houses, the daily life of a Roman town is still visible in a way that no other site anywhere can offer. Consider the house of the baker, which stood on a side street off one of the main roads. When it was excavated, the archaeologists found the round stone mills, 4 of them, ranged along one side of the courtyard, their grinding surfaces still worn smooth by the last morning's work. They found the domed brick oven at the back of the shop, and inside it, still where the baker had put them, a batch of loaves. 81 round loaves, each divided into 8 wedges by cuts in the top, in the pattern that Roman bakers had used for centuries and that Italian bakers still use today. The loaves were carbonized black, but they were unmistakably loaves, and they were unmistakably ready to be pulled out and sold. That morning's work had gone into the oven, and no one had ever come back to take it out. Consider the fullery of Stephanus, which was one of the many laundries in the town. The clothes were washed in vats using a mixture of water and human urine, which was collected in jars set out along the streets for that purpose, because the ammonia in it was the strongest cleaning agent available. The workers stood in the vats and trod the cloth with their feet, in an activity that is preserved in the wall paintings of the shop itself, showing men laughing as they worked. In the front of the shop, on the last day, someone had been counting money. A skeleton was found there, clutching a bag of coins, killed in the act of trying to take the day's earnings and flee. The coins were still in the bag when the archaeologists opened it. Consider the house of the tragic poet, which was named for one of its paintings, but which is really known for the mosaic just inside its front door. A black and white image of a dog straining at a chain, with the words cave CANEM written beneath it in Latin capitals. Beware of the dog. The mosaic is still there, at the threshold, and any visitor to Pompeii who steps carefully over it is doing what a visitor to the Roman family who lived here was expected to do 1900 years ago. The dog itself, presumably, is one of the animals whose casts were later made. Consider the House of the Faun, which was the largest and most magnificent private house in Pompeii, big enough to occupy an entire city block. Its owner was a man of extraordinary wealth, whose name we do not know for certain, and he had decorated his home with mosaics that are among the greatest surviving works of ancient art. The most famous is the enormous mosaic of Alexander the Great facing the Persian king Darius at the Battle of Issus, made of 1,000,000 small stones, showing Alexander charging on his horse and Darius wheeling his chariot in the moment of defeat. The mosaic was set into the floor of one of the dining rooms, where the guests could look at it while they ate. It is now in the National Archaeological Museum in Naples, where you can still stand in front of it and see, in tiny colored stones, the exact moment when the fate of an empire was decided. But the house itself is still there, in Pompeii, and if you walk through it, you can see where the mosaic once was, and you can imagine the dinner parties held above it, and the wine that was drunk, and the conversations that were had on the ordinary evenings of the last century of the town. Consider the Villa of the Mysteries, just outside the walls to the north, one of the country estates of a wealthy family. In one room of this villa, on the walls, a great painted frieze runs around the entire chamber, showing a series of figures engaged in what appears to be a religious initiation into the mysteries of the god Dionysus. There is a young woman being prepared for something. There are winged figures. There is a scene of ritual whipping. There is a bride being dressed. The colors are as vivid as if they had been painted yesterday, deep reds and yellows and blacks, and the figures are life-size, and they are among the most extraordinary examples of ancient painting anywhere in the world. Scholars have debated for a century and a half what exactly the frieze depicts, and they still disagree. But every visitor who stands in that room stands in a Roman religious sanctuary as it looked to the people who worshipped in it, and there is no other place on earth where that is possible. And then there are the people. In the sheds and museum buildings at the site, and in the National Archaeological Museum in Naples, are the plaster casts that Fiorelli began to make in 1863, and that his successors have continued to make ever since, using improved techniques that now include translucent resins that allow the bones inside the cast to be visible along with the shape of the body. Each cast is a person. Each person had a name and a life and a family and a set of things they were doing on the last morning, and each of them is still there in plaster, in the last posture that person ever held. There is the family in the house of the golden bracelet, a father, a mother, a small child in her arms, another child at her side. They were together at the moment the surge came, and they died together, and the casts show them together still. There is the muleteer who was found near the town gate, kneeling, with one hand raised toward his face as though to protect his eyes. He had almost made it out. There is the pregnant woman, whose cast shows the shape of the child she carried, and who was never buried in a grave, because her grave had been made for her already by the ash. There is the man who was found sitting up against a wall, his back straight, his hands on his knees, looking almost as though he had chosen his last posture with care. And there is the dog on his chain, still contorted in the shape of the last leap he made, up the rising column of ash toward the air he could not reach. When visitors see him, they often stop and stand for a long time without speaking. There are also the things that were not people. Rooms full of glass bottles, still holding traces of the wine or oil that had been in them. Boxes of jewelry, gold rings and earrings, and necklaces of pearl and emerald, which the archaeologists lifted out gently and cleaned. Wax tablets from the office of the banker Eucundus, whose loans and receipts we can still read. Ornate wooden furniture, in the case of Herculaneum, actually preserved intact by carbonization. Panels of graffiti, saved by clever techniques of consolidation, still telling us who was in love with whom, and which candidate the wool merchants were backing, and what particular gladiator had made every girl of Pompeii sigh. In one bar, a customer had scratched into the wall, on the last evening or the evening before, the words "I made bread on the 9th day before the kalends of November," which some scholars have taken as a possible reference to the date on which the customer had done his ordinary work. Whether or not that reading is correct, it is a scrap of daily life preserved by a disaster, and there are thousands of such scraps. Herculaneum, being smaller and buried deeper, was more slowly and more painfully excavated. Much of it lies still beneath the modern town of Ercolano, but what has been recovered is astonishing in its intimacy. The wooden staircase of a house, still climbable, the wooden shutters of a shop, still hanging, the bones of the people who had gathered in the boat sheds on the beach, several hundred of them, discovered only in 1980 and studied since then with modern forensic care. Each skeleton is that of a real person. Their teeth tell us what they had eaten. Their bones tell us what work they had done. Some of them had been slaves, and their skeletons show the marks of hard labor from childhood. Others had been the children of the wealthy, whose bones show them healthy and well fed. All of them died together, in that instant of superheated air on the beach at Herculaneum, and their bones lay in the same positions for exactly 1901 years before anyone knew they were there. In the final section, we will pull back from the ash and the plaster and consider what Pompeii and Herculaneum have given us, and what they still ask of us, and why, of all the many losses of the ancient world, this one loss has become the strangest and most complete gift. The strange gift that Pompeii and Herculaneum have given to the world is not, in the end, a collection of objects or a set of ruins. It is a way of seeing. Before Pompeii, the ancient Romans were known to us in the way that most ancient peoples are known, through their monuments and their literature. We had the great buildings that they had wanted to be remembered by: temples, arches, columns, tombs of the powerful. We had the words of their poets and historians, the letters of their statesmen, the treatises of their philosophers. These told us what the Romans wanted the future to know about them. They were, in a way, a curated self-portrait, arranged by the Romans themselves and passed down through the sifting of centuries. Pompeii gave us something no other site anywhere had ever given anyone. It gave us a Roman town that had not been curated. It gave us the accidental, unedited, uncleaned, unposed life of a middle-sized provincial city on an ordinary morning. It gave us not the great temple in the Forum, alone against the sky, but the temple with the scaffolding still up from an earthquake 17 years earlier, and the graffiti of a bored slave scratched onto its base, and the last bunch of flowers left by a worshipper on the day of the disaster. It gave us the wealthy man's dining room, but also his kitchen, with the ashes of his last fire still on the hearth. It gave us the mansion of the local aristocrat, but also the tiny apartment of the widow next door, with her single lamp and her 2 cooking pots. It gave us the elegant politician's painted portrait, but also the mocking cartoon a schoolboy had drawn of him on a wall around the corner. It gave us Rome, in other words, not as Rome had wanted to be remembered, but as Rome had actually been on a random autumn Tuesday when nobody was watching. That is a gift of extraordinary rarity. Most of what we know about most of ancient life comes from a very narrow slice of the population, the wealthy men who could write and who wrote things they thought worth preserving. The lives of ordinary Roman farmers, shopkeepers, laundresses, mule drivers, prostitutes, freed slaves and children are almost entirely lost to us from the standard literary record. They lived, they worked, they suffered, they loved, they died, and their days were not written down. Pompeii wrote them down for them, or rather, buried them in a way that preserved them by accident. And we walk into the room where a Pompeian family lived, and we see the small altar to the household gods with the offerings still on it, and the amphora of wine still leaning against the wall, and the loom with a piece of half-finished weaving still stretched on it. We are looking at a class of human life that history had otherwise mostly forgotten. This is what makes the moral weight of Pompeii so peculiar. The disaster that killed the town is the only reason we know the town at all. If Vesuvius had never erupted in 79, Pompeii would have gone on being an ordinary Roman country town and would have decayed slowly through the centuries in the way that other ordinary Roman country towns decayed. Its walls would have been robbed for stone. Its temples would have been converted into churches and then into other buildings, and finally would have vanished. Its houses would have been rebuilt many times over. Its inscriptions would have been ground into road fill. Its paintings would have flaked off the walls. Its wax tablets would have crumbled. Its people, of course, would have died anyway, but at their normal times, of old age or of ordinary illness, and their names would have died with them, and their loaves of bread would have been eaten, and their dogs would have been buried in gardens instead of being cast in plaster and displayed in museums, and no one, at any point in the following 20 centuries, would have any reason to remember any of them. Instead, they were killed. They were killed in a single terrible morning by a mountain that had no name for what it was. And because they were killed in that way, on that morning, they were preserved. The volcano that murdered the city is the only reason we know the city. Every one of the Pompeians whose face we can now see in plaster, whose gestures we can still study, whose belongings we can still hold, is a person who died in one of the worst deaths of the ancient world and who lives on because of it. There is no way to make peace with this except to be honest about it. Our knowledge of them is built on their deaths, our fondness for them, and it is impossible not to feel a real fondness for them once you have spent any time with them, is a fondness for people who paid a very high price to become our companions across the years. The Pompeians themselves, of course, thought about none of this. They did not know they were being preserved. They did not know they were becoming, in a strange way, the most famous inhabitants of any Roman town that ever existed. They did not know their loaves of bread would still be looked at 19 centuries after they baked them, or that their political posters would still be read after the empire that governed them had fallen and been forgotten and been rediscovered by scholars of another age. They died believing they were dying. What they became afterward was not part of their calculations. This too is worth sitting with. The scientific legacy of Pompeii runs alongside the human one. The account written by young Pliny for Tacitus so many years after the fact turned out to be, as we have seen, so accurate that modern volcanologists still study it as a technical document. When they classified explosive eruptions of the type that Vesuvius had produced in 79, with their tall sustained columns and their pyroclastic collapses, they gave them the name Plinian, and they still call them that. When they wanted to understand how these eruptions worked, and what their warning signs might be, they turned to Pliny's letter and to the physical evidence in the ash. The layers of pumice and ash at Pompeii and Herculaneum, examined by geologists and volcanologists, told the physical story of the eruption in a level of detail that few other eruptions in history have offered. From those layers, scientists have been able to reconstruct almost every hour of the 2 days of the disaster, matching their reconstructions against Pliny's words to a remarkable degree of agreement. This matters because Vesuvius has not stopped. It has erupted many times since 79, though never on that scale. Its last major eruption was in 1944, during the Second World War, when the mountain interrupted the fighting on the Italian front to bury villages in ash and destroy squadrons of American aircraft parked at its foot. It has been quiet since then, for the longest period of dormancy in its recorded history. Everything geologists know about the mountain suggests that the quiet cannot last forever. Some 3 million people now live within reach of a future Plinian eruption of Vesuvius, in and around the city of Naples. The population at risk is one of the highest of any active volcano on Earth. The people who study these things do not doubt that Vesuvius will erupt again, and that when it does, if it is not carefully watched, the death toll could rival or exceed anything the ancient world knew. The Pompeians, in a sense, are still teaching. Their deaths are still being studied so that other people, who have never heard their names, may not have to die in the same way. And there is one final beat to this story, which brings us back to where we began. In 1863, when Giuseppe Fiorelli first poured plaster into the hollow spaces of Pompeii and pulled out the shapes of the people who had died there, he did something that no archaeologist had ever done before. He made the past look back at the present. Before that moment, the ancient dead were skeletons, or busts, or names on inscriptions. After that moment at Pompeii, they were suddenly people again, mid-gesture, mid-breath, mid-thought, arrested in a single instant that had lasted for 17 centuries, and that now lasted for as long as anyone stood in front of them. The family holding each other, the muleteer raising his hand, the woman lying on her side with the golden bracelet still around her wrist, the pregnant mother. The dog on his chain. They looked at us, and they still look at us, and they will keep looking at us as long as their casts are cared for, and as long as anyone comes to see them. They do not accuse, they do not plead, they do not ask for anything because they cannot. What they do, in the strange way that only they can do it, is to insist that they were real. They insist that the ordinary morning they lived through, before the mountain spoke, was as real as the ordinary morning that any of us lived through today. They insist that the loaves of bread they had shaped, and the coins they had counted, and the children they had held, and the political candidates they had argued about, and the graffiti they had scratched onto the walls of their favorite bars, were all real things done by real people. They insist, in short, that the past was not a story or a myth or a decoration. It was people, just people, doing the things people do, until it wasn't. That is what Pompeii finally is. It is a place where the past has stopped being an idea and started being a neighbor. It is a town, still standing, in which 1900 years ago a thing beyond imagination happened, and which for that terrible reason still exists to be walked through and stood in and wondered at. It is a warning about what mountains can do. It is a monument to the ordinary. And it is the closest thing that the study of the human past has ever produced to a direct meeting of eyes across the centuries. And that is the story of the last days of Pompeii. From an ordinary morning in the shadow of a mountain nobody feared to the plaster faces that still look at us today. If you are still awake, there is another video waiting for you on the screen whenever you feel ready to keep the journey going. If you enjoyed this one, feel free to like, subscribe, or leave a thought down in the comments. There is no rush. For now, set everything aside, rest easy and let yourself settle. Close your eyes and let the day go. Sleep well and sweet dreams. Peace.